Hello and welcome once again to Solo Board Gaming Presents, and today we have Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. This is a hidden gem. Well, it was a hidden gem for me. I've only just discovered this game fairly recently. As soon as I did discover it, by the way, I ordered it immediately. I've had 4 complete playthroughs of this in the last 3 days. I'm absolutely gripped by it. It might be one of the most exciting games I've played this entire year. It's a game by Per Sylvester and Richard Sivell, and it's from Histogame. I said it's a hidden gem, however, this game has a huge and very loyal following over the years, and I've only just tapped into that. It suits me perfectly. It's a political game. It's a 2-player game, but perfect solo, and hopefully I'll be able to show you exactly why that is. It's a political game, yes, but don't be deceived. This is a war game. Not because of tanks, bombs and aircraft, but because it is so aggressive. And you are always trying to stymie the growth and foil the plans of your opponents. Let's take a look at the board. It's an amazing board, actually. I've had to slightly change my video angle for this because it's quite a long board, long and narrow, and it's pointing to the north, as you can see here. But basically it starts in 1949 with Germany still in ruins from World War II. Germany split in 2, and that Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, and we are now entering the Cold War. East Germany and West Germany become bitter rivals, each wanting to show that its system is superior to the other. But what's this game about? Well, which nation will construct quicker or reconstruct quicker? Which will make its people happier? Socialism versus capitalism, collectivism versus individualism, and which will triumph? Wir sind das Volk was the slogan of the late 1980s, particularly 1989 protests in East Germany, and it recreates the history of a divided Germany from the Berlin airlift to the fall of the Berlin Wall. The game uses action cards, and in doing that it helps you plan to build up your economy, increase your living standards, but also try not to fall behind the other, because that will increase widespread unrest and protest. Hence, wir sind das Volk. And you can see the game map divided between what became West Germany here and the small country of East Germany, or the DDR. Actually, we know them as different things, and funnily enough, I know East Germany as DDR or DDR, and West Germany as the BRD, Bundesrepublik Deutschland and Deutsche Demokratische Republik. And of course, we show the island of Berlin here, and that has a larger representation there at the top right of the map, where you have West Berlin and East Berlin, and you can see they show the wall surrounding West Berlin there, and the different sectors of the French, British and American occupying forces, the different zones there, and they are actually replicated here on the main board, where you have Nord Rhine-Westphalen for the British zone, where you have Rhineland-Pfalz for the French zone, and Baden-Württemberg for the American zone. And it's these zones during the game that will support West Berlin. What else do we have on the map? We have some tracks. Down here we have the flight track, and this is going to indicate to us how much of the population is fleeing from East Germany into West Germany. Up the top there, the top track, we have the prestige track. And that's going to show us how much prestige the West or the East is earning from its face to the outside world. The next track, the green one, is foreign currency. That was very, very important to East Germany to earn foreign currency to support its economy and living standards, basically because the East German currency was worthless on the global market. And the pink track there is the socialist track. That is socialism. Will socialism increase and eventually win the day, or will it be defeated and lose the game for East Germany? And there we have a little box there where we put our little socialist blocks, but we'll come to all that. And then we have down here the 10-phase end of decade track. So the game is divided into 4 decades. We have the 49 to 59, so we have the 50s, 60s, the 70s and the 80s, and you'll play through all 4 decades, and at the end of each decade there'll be an end of decade reckoning. So components wise then, we have the map, we have 4 decks of action cards, we have a ton of wonderful components that I've just piled up over here for now. Nice chunky components, and we'll look at those in detail, including lots of nice wooden blocks as well. We have a great rule book. I really enjoyed this rule book. Now the rule book is half-half, English and German. So the English language side starts there and the German side starts opposite, and they meet in the middle. So the entire rule book is, oh, that was lucky, open it at the middle, is only half the size of this book. 10 pages, I think. 10 pages, and then a ton of designer notes, which are really, really good. I really recommend reading those designer notes. But the rule book itself is incredibly well illustrated. Look at that, the setup of the game, all the components, and then we explain the cards and the tracks and the components. Lots of examples, some really great historical texts as well. We have a table there of all the icons: police powers, socialists, prestige and flight from the Republic. Really great rule book. It's colourful, it's really interesting to read as well, and explains the game perfectly. Love that rule book, that's really nice. So we're going to start getting down into the meat of the game first. We're going to look at how then we start to build up our economy right at the beginning of the first decade of this story, of this game. One thing worth remembering before we go closer down and start this is that beyond this dividing line here, what became known as East Germany, or the DDR, was in the Soviet zone, and the rest, West Germany, or the BRD, was in the Western Allies zone. Now, they had different approaches as to how each was going to govern their respective zones. First of all, and this is really important, a lot of people forget this, East Germany was a really tiny country. It was a tiny country. Geographically, it was only 1/3 the size of the whole area. Secondly, it contained only 25% of the entire German population. And one of the things that you're going to have to try and do in the game, if you're playing as East Germany or if you're playing solo, each side to the best of your ability, to try and stem the tide of population that's going to try and flee from the Soviet-controlled East into the Allied controlled West. When we start this game, the Soviet Union was already dismantling most of the German factories and equipment that could be used back in the Soviet Union. I believe something like 17,000 factories or factory equivalents. Just when this place needed to be built up was actually being dismantled, anything useful and taken back to the Soviet Union. Very different approach from the Allied side, where the Allies quickly realised that West Germany was going to have to be a forward base and its economy was going to have to be built up again to rival what was happening in the East. So millions and millions, billions of dollars was poured in to the reconstruction of West Germany, leading to what some people called the miracle on the Rhine. So it's against that background that you're starting this game. So now, how do we build up that economy? Let's go down and take a look. Okay, so there we are, a little bit more zoomed in. Just for now, please ignore the little blue blocks because we'll come on to those very, very shortly. So as you can see, the map is divided into provinces for the western provinces. For the east, Sachsen-Anhalt, Niedersachsen, Hessen, Thüringen, Bayern, and so on. And the map portrays the major cities within those areas. One of the first set-up cities, for instance, for the east, and you can tell because it's a different shape, it isn't a circle like Jena here. Bitterfeld is an irregular shape, as is Berlin. And over on the west, Hamburg is an irregular shape, as is Dortmund. Each player, each side, starts off with two factories, and the factories are these triangles. This is a western factory because it's yellow. The main colour for the west is yellow. Anything yellow normally means west. On the other side, it goes 1, 2, 3, and on the other side, it goes 4, 5, 6. And we start off with a factory in Hamburg, and we start off with a factory in Dortmund. Now, you'll notice that I've placed each one with the 1 pointed upwards, north. That's significant. The 1 is pointed upwards because that's the value of each factory. Let's just put the eastern factories on there in Bitterfeld with the 1 value pointing upwards, and here in Berlin with the 1 value pointed upwards. So when a factory is not connected, that is its value. One other thing you're doing is building infrastructure. And infrastructure is the connections, the logistics that's connecting one or more factories together. So for instance, if we look over here in Dortmund, when you first lay that, you'll use the red side because it's not yet connected. When you get to lay another factory, for instance in Bielefeld here, that becomes a working connection, and the value of these two factories now goes up. Each factory is worth its base value of 1 plus another 1 for the amount of connections it has. So that's now a 2. Let's move these out of the way. And this is also now a 2. So you can see how that economy there is growing, 2 and 2, because each factory is worth itself plus the amount of connections it has. Let's have a look over here at the east. So the east places a connection there, for instance, and then places another factory here in Magdeburg. Don't have to do it that way around. Could have placed the factory first and the connection afterwards. But either way, that connection is now valid. So it goes over to the east's colour, which is red, and the value of the factories increases. 2, 2. Each factory, its own value, plus the number of factories it's connected to. Let's just try one more. For instance, if the West builds a factory there in where's that? Is that Hanover? its value will be 1. It's not connected to anything. Once it gets connected, its value goes up to 2. Now notice when I do that, the value of this factory here in Bielefeld goes up to 3. Its own base value plus its number of connections. It has 2 connections equaling 3. Let's just drop in another connection here for the east, like so. So that value goes up to 2, that value goes up to 3. So that's how you can see the value of your economy increasing. There are cards, actions and effects that your opponent will play, and some even of your own cards that you will play, that will force you to dismantle infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean factories and or connections. You can't dismantle a factory before an infrastructure, for instance. So if we were forced to dismantle an infrastructure, that would come off. If we had to dismantle another now, that could come off. Okay? But when you do so, for instance, when we take that away, that connection away, that value of that factory now goes down to 1. So you're doing this all the while, and that goes down to 2. It still has a connection to Bitterfeld. So let's just put that back on. Another thing that can happen to the east, and this is unique to the east, again through an event or an action card that the opponent may play, is a factory in the east can become run down. There you go, it's a similar marker, but it has a broken cog on it, so it can become run down. Now, for instance, if let's do Bitterfeld. If Bitterfeld had to become run down, that factory counter would come off and the broken one would go on. The run down factory. It's no longer as efficient as it was. It has old technology, or it can't get parts, or its production is inefficient. So it now has a base value of 0, no longer 1. So it doesn't count itself anymore, but it still counts its connections. So on this particular example, its value would be 1. In other words, simply the value of the sum of the amount of connections it has. And it has, as you see, only 1 connection. So its value is 1. Those run-down factories, as I say, are unique to the east. Now, let's briefly come back to the little blue blocks, the little blue markers. Those denote unrest. Various events played by yourself or by your opponent can increase the amount of unrest in any particular province. Let me just grab some unrest counters from over here. So, if unrest increases, another block is put on, for instance. So here in Hessen, unrest has increased. So a 4th block goes on. Any area that receives a 4th block now gets a protest marker. And for the west, they are the yellow markers. Keine. Like so. If I just put these out like so, the west protest markers go keine Macht für niemand. Like so. Translated on the other side, no power to no one. Or nobody. No power to no one. Keine Macht für niemand. So that protest marker would go there, like so. The West now is going to want to have to try and, again, by using actions from the cards, remove that protest marker. Why? Because while that protest marker is there, no more building, no more development, no more increase in the economy or in living standards can go in that province. So that's quite devastating. So to do that, Again, by using the action cards, they need to remove a unrest marker. And when they do that, they can remove the protest marker. You see? So if it increases to 4 unrest, you get a protest marker. If there are, at the end of any decade, when there are 4 protest markers, and this is during the end of decade checks, if there are 4 protest markers in the west or in the east, that side has lost the game because the protests have become too much. And basically there has been a people's revolution. Now, you can sort of see that happening, can't you, in the East because of the history that we know of. But we forget it was also happening in the West. If we look at our Western culture during the late 60s, the 70s and through the 80s, there were mass protest movements all over our nations, both in the United States and in Western Europe, for different reasons. There were mass protests protesting, remember CND, against nuclear armament. There were mass protests basically because of what some would call the success, if you like, of capitalism. Because what happened then was, and it remains so to an extent today, the gap between rich and poor became wider and wider and wider. So hence those mass protests through the late 60s, the 70s and into the 80s. The same in the East, where they are looking at Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. Again, mass protests at this time, well, various reasons. Mainly is dissatisfaction toward the communist government, the style of government. East Germany had many successes, but it had those successes at a huge cost, and the cost was freedom. Many of these people in the border states could pick up on Western television and were learning what they were actually missing out on. And that's particularly true of Berlin. There was a lot of repression, and the Stasi through the 70s and certainly through the 80s was growing exponentially. And very few citizens were left untouched by the exploits of the Stasi. So the East can fall as well before they get to the end of the 80s decade, before 1989. However, if you get, and this is interesting, if you get to a point at the end of each decade where both the West and the East each have 4 mass protest markers, have both lost? You'd think so. Is it a draw? You'd think so, but it can't be, can it? Because if both have 4, then still the East will win. If you like, it's almost expected of the East. All the East has to do in this game to win is to teeter towards still being in existence at the end of 1989, and it's won. It's actually more difficult for the West to win. The West has to cause the collapse of the East before the end of that final decade. So let's move on to the next component of the game. Actually, let me take some of these off. I think I'll leave that one there because that might help illustrate something. So, and let's take off that, and that, which means we have to take off that. And we have to add one to there, because I'm leaving that mass protest marker there and that mass protest marker there. There we go. So let's move on to living standards then, before we move on to by far the best part of the game, and that is the cards, which we'll look at very, very soon. So, living standards. Living standards are these are they octagonal? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, these octagonal wooden blocks here. These represent living standards. Now, again, there are various opportunities by using the cards to increase your living standards. Because you're trying to keep down protest, build up your economy, all in order to increase your living standards. So when a card or an action allows you to increase your living standards, you can place them on the map. But you can place them on the map only where your economy in a particular province is high enough. So let's look at the economy of Niedersachsen here. The economy, as I mentioned before, is measured by the sum of the factories. There are 2 factories in Niedersachsen, value of 1 and value of 2. So, to place one living standard, the economy has to be at a level of 3. And this one is at a level of 3. So we could place a living standard here in Niedersachsen, except no, we can't. Why? Because at the moment there's a mass protest marker there, so no increase in living standard. Again, that emphasises the importance of keeping the mass protests down, keeping down the unrest, keeping down the mass protests. So let's look at another province. Here in North Rhine-Westphalia, we have an economy of 3, 4, 5. It's at least 3, so we can put a living standard marker there. One more thing, if the value was 6 instead of 5, we could have 2 living standards there. So it's an economy of 3 per living standard. So an economy of 9 would mean we could have up to 3 living standards there. But at the moment there we can only have 1. Now if we didn't have the mass protest marker there, take that off, in which case we have to take off an unrest. So we now can see that economy value of 3, so it can place a living standard there as well as there. And also the East can do the same. They have a living standard of 2 and 1, that's 3, so they can place one there. We can't raise the living standard in Brandenburg because it only has an economy of 2, and I haven't put any more factory markers out anyway. Now, you have to be careful about how you raise and where you raise your living standards. It's absolutely what you need to do, and yet, for instance, and I keep talking about this, it's going to happen 4 times per game. The end of each decade, you're going to have an end of decade reckoning. And it's going to start comparing living standards. Because if, first of all, you compare the living standards of each of your provinces. And if the living standards in a province grows too far ahead of neighbouring provinces, that can cause unrest. That's that income gap I'm talking about. That's that gap between rich and poor getting greater. And if that happens, you're going to start attracting unrest and mass protest. So you have to be careful at how you're applying living standards within your own country. And similarly, let's say our economy here had reached 6, and we now have 2 living standards there. Those living standards at the end of a decade, during that end of decade reckoning, those living standards can now directly attack your opponents. And again, not by tanks, guns, bombs and aircraft, but by the bordering province recognising all too clearly, and that's normally, for instance, by illegally watching Western television, that can cause unrest in the neighbouring province across the border. So it can increase unrest, like so, which means it can increase or cause mass protest. So in the end of decade reckoning, things can happen very, very quickly. The end of decade reckoning, and it happens 4 times per game, remember, is a very exciting, very intense part of the game. So we've talked about infrastructure, we've talked about factories and how the economy increases there, we've talked about connections, we've talked about unrest, mass protests and living standards. So how does all that happen? I keep talking about the actions and events of the cards. Let's get down to those cards. So the first decade of 4 decades, and this one is 1945 to 1959. The other decades are here, the 60s, the 70s and the 80s. Each decade has 20 normal cards and 1 special card. The special card is here for the first decade. It's a red card. So the 4 special cards, 1 in each decade, can only be played by the East German player. That's why they're in red. So I'm just going to place that there for the time being. That's the special card for the first decade. Then we deal out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cards. And we place them face up in the tableau, like so. Just look at these cards. Absolutely beautiful cards, beautiful artwork, every single one of them displaying an event of that particular decade. So these 7 cards can be played by either player, and in turn, starting with the player who has the most prestige, and at the beginning of the game, it's the player playing West Germany, will pick a card. Play that card, and then the opposing player will pick a card, but you're all picking from the same tableau. At the same time, 2 more cards are dealt to each player. 2 to the Western player and 2 to the East player. And they're kept in hand, and the opposing player doesn't know what cards you hold, obviously. Unless you're playing solo, both sides to the best of your abilities, in which case you'll keep them face down, for instance, and quite quickly forget what cards are there. And that's genuine. I tend to be able to do that quite well. But there is only 2 of them in each hand. Now, back to these 7 cards. So, first thing to note is that they are of different colours. Cards in red only, if you look at the picture on them, the image on them, can only be played by the red player, the East German player. Cards in yellow can only be played by the West German player. Cards that are in both colours, you see there's a difference there. That card is both yellow and red. That's a dual card, and it can be played by either player. Now when I say played by, I mean for the events, because each card can be played in 4 different ways. Every single card can be played in 4 different ways. And I know that there are going to be people now seeing similarities between this and Twilight Struggle. I absolutely agree, except this is better. And I'm willing to take the brickbats from Twilight Struggle fans, but I'm one of those fans. But this is better because of the 7 cards you lay in this marketplace here. They're there for all to see and can be chosen by either player. So we can choose each card for and use it for one of 4 different ways. First of all, the most inefficient way, I suppose, to use it is to pick a card, let's say this one. Nice illustration there, see, of that tractor, and that's a yellow card, Dismantling Industry in the East, it's called. Now, I can use that card, play the card, to remove 1 unrest block in one of my provinces. Okay? But that's inefficient. It's wasted the whole card. That's all I'm going to do to remove 1 unrest block. Now, you'd have to be fairly desperate to do that, because there's many other things this card could be used for. The next thing it could be used for is the yellow number 3 or the red number 1. So the yellow number 3, the west player, because it's a yellow card anyway, can use it to build 3 infrastructure. That's factories and or connections. If the red player wanted to use this card, it'll only get 1 point of infrastructure building. So 1 factory or 1 connection. The next thing the card could be used for, again, we're still ignoring the events at the moment, is building living standards. You could just play the card and use it to build up to 3 living standards, but no more than 1 in each of 3 provinces. So you could pick 3 provinces, and as long as they have the required economy level, you could put a living standard in each. So we've so far been able to use it to remove 1 unrest, or to build 3 if you're the west, or 1 if you're the east infrastructure, or to lay 3 living standards in qualifying provinces. Finally, the 4th way to use this card is to use the actual event. The event has a title, Dismantling Industry in the East. Look how powerful that is. Now, only yellow can use this. If any card is being played for an event, only the colour of the player, and in this case it's yellow west, can trigger the event. Dismantling Industry in the East will dismantle 1, 2, 3 infrastructure items, factories or connections in East Germany. Whoa, that's powerful. Nasty card. You see what I mean about this game being really aggressive. It also adds, there's that fist there, an unrest in any province. And it also moves the socialist track down by 1. Powerful card to be used by the West German player if you're using it for events. Let's look at another one for West Germany. What a beautiful card. Now, okay, as I said, you could use it, just throw away the whole card, just to use it to remove 1 unrest, or to build 4 infrastructure in your provinces, that's factories and connections, or if it's the red player using it, just 1 infrastructure, or to place 3 living standards in qualifying provinces, or you could use, but only if you're the yellow player, to trigger the event, the Wirtschaftswunder. Wirtschaftswunder is the miracle on the Rhine, and that is the results of the billions of dollars pumped into the economy by the West, producing an industrial powerhouse. So if you trigger the event, you're going to get 3 infrastructure builds, you can remove a protest marker, and you can add a protest marker to the east. Now you see again how thematic and historical that is. It's really benefiting the West hugely, but also because some people in the East, some sections of society can see that, So it starts to cause unrest in the east as well. A brilliant card. Let's look at a card for the Reds, for East Germany. Forced merger of the KPD and SPD. This happened quite early. This is when parties were merging, and it almost became East Germany a one-party state. That's the SED. Now, fine. If the yellow player wanted to use this, it would only get one build point, or the East Germany could use it for 3 build points, or, as I said before, to lay living standards in qualifying provinces, or you could use it for the actual card event itself if you're the red player, and that is to build 1 infrastructure, but you'd also lay 1 unrest token, because not everybody's happy about this political change, but you'd advance socialism by 2 on the socialism track. Notice one more thing. There's a flight marker here. See that red running figure? Because we collect all the cards that have been used during this decade. And part of the end of decade reckoning is to count up how many flight markers there are on the discarded cards. And that's how many people have escaped from the east to the west. And dismantling of the economy takes place accordingly. And it's that flight that you've got to try and stop. Does that mean you build the Berlin Wall? Because that has very detrimental effects as well. You could try a what if scenario. You could build the Berlin Wall, of course you could. Or you could try not building it at all. That is permissible. You don't have to do that. What would happen if you didn't do that? Again, a great historical card. The special event card is a major one. During 1953, there were huge protests in East Germany. Russian tanks poured particularly into Berlin to crush those protests. This is 1953. And you can take off 2 mass protest markers because the tanks crushed them. You could take off 2 unrest markers because basically the population ends up kowtowing, knuckling down, putting their eyes down and getting on with their work because of the effect of the Russian tanks. However, to the outside world, it's not good. So your prestige moves down by 1, but socialism moves up by 1. But look at the overall effect for the end of decade. 2 of those flight markers. Now, you don't have to play the card at all. You just don't have to do it. But in removing unrest and mass protest, it's a brilliant card. So you may have to do that depending on how your country is doing. Once the last of the standard cards, not that one, because that one doesn't have to be played, but once the last of the standard cards has been played, that's when you now deal yourself another 7 cards from that deck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And deal them out. The Stasi is founded. Joining the CMEA. I'd have to have a look at that. Isn't that the Warsaw Pact's economic zone or something like that? The Miracle of Bern. That's for the West. The Tsar Protectorate. Monetary reform in the East. NATO membership and rearmament. Reparations agreement with Israel. That's got a flight marker on it, look. And on the ones I've just dealt out, there are no more flight markers. So again, some are red, some are yellow. So the events can only be played by that particular player, but the cards can be played for those other 3 reasons. Don't forget to remove unrest, to build infrastructure or to lay living standards. This one has 2 infrastructure build points. This one has just 1, and so on. Now, once you've played all 7 of those cards, I mean, look at this one. For red, it's a red event card, and if you didn't want to play it to remove unrest, or to lay infrastructure, or to lay living standards, you could trigger the event joining the CMEA, and there you could lay the 2 factories in Czechoslovakia and the 2 factories in Poland. But you've got 1 unrest, but it moves up your foreign exchange by 1. And you also each have the cards that are in your hand. Remember those 2 cards each? For instance, these are the ones that ended up in the hand of the East, and luckily both were red as well. You got the Göttingen 18, and I'd have to look at that. And again, I love the way it inspires you to Google some of these things, to fill in the gaps of your history of the period. And then the other one is joining the Warsaw Pact. So again, a brilliant set of cards. There's 84 cards altogether you play through this decade. And the replay value is immense. As I say, I played 4 games in 3 days. Every single time, I mean, literally totally different. You certainly can't plan beforehand, but you do need to start planning ahead. Every time a card is played, it can be played one of 4 different ways. So every game is going to be different. When it comes up in the game is also going to make every single game completely different. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I've literally only just scratched the surface, really. There's tons more strategy and there's a lot more mechanics that I haven't been able to show. It would have to be a lot longer video for that. I'm very, very tempted to do a playthrough demonstration of this game, maybe to play through just 1 single decade. I may get to do that if I'm lucky, but I've got a busy couple of weeks coming up for various reasons. But I would love to do that. Meanwhile, if you're at all interested, go get this game right now. It's available again right now from various suppliers and from the Histogame website. And it's one of those games that, despite the high quality of the components and the enormity, to be honest, of the gameplay, it's available at a really good retail price. So, hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Meanwhile, if you can get round to it, if you don't mind, please like this video and please subscribe. It's going to make a huge difference to me going forward. Thanks very, very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.